Hello everybody. I'm going to start out by talking about MA Character Animation, the course that I work on, our experience of working with museums, archives and cultural organisations, and then I'm going to talk about one exhibition we worked on in particular. Our work with the museums and archives was initiated on the transcriptions project for the National Gallery. So we worked with Lee Riley, who was the education officer at the National Gallery between 2006 and 2011. And the course produced around 180 animations for the website that interpreted paintings from the collection and demonstrated their relevance to non-traditional audiences. Students were enriched by the experience, which had enormous educational benefit. They analysed the paintings in depth in terms of context, composition, use of colour and physical gesture through historical lectures, drawing and physical workshops. The range of paintings on display in the collection proved a valuable resource to stimulate ideas for character designs, for stories, for poses, visual compositions and themes. Following this experience of working with historic paintings, the course has gone to interpret many types of archival materials for public exhibition. So we've worked with oral history collections, creating characters that speak archival recordings. We've done this for the National Theatre Archive, London Transport Museum and the British Library. We've also worked with graphic design and printed ephemera, working with the London Transport Museum's extensive poster collection, as well as the British Post Office Museum and Archive. We've also worked with text, so Shakespearean drama text. We interpreted the repertory for the Royal Shakespeare Company's contribution to the Cultural Olympiad. And we're currently working with opera, creating short animations to form part of the online publicity for the English National Opera's forthcoming shows. We've also worked with some quite complex ideas like architecture, visualising theoretical ideas about liquid architecture for the British Pavilion at the Shenzhen Architecture Biennale in China. And we've also created community engagement experiences, so using animation to reach out to non-traditional audiences with workshops and events. We've done this at the BFI, the Drawing Room Gallery, the V&A and the Royal Albert Hall. But today I'm going to focus on our work with historical artefacts, which we've done with the Old Operating Theatre Museum. So Cut was an exhibition at the Old Operating Theatre Museum last year in 2014. The museum sited in a former anatomical theatre in Herb Garret of the ancient St Thomas's Hospital in London, where it's been a working hospital for over 1,000 years previously. With this project, the museum's creative director, Kevin Flood, was particularly interested in attempting to bring back a sense of all the people who'd once occupied this space, so formerly a working hospital, now a museum. The exhibition was created through a collaboration between four main partners, so my course, MA Character Animation, MA Culture Criticism and Curation, led by Alison at Central St Martin's, and we also worked with music composition students from the London Guildhall School of Music, which was led by four members of staff, and with the museum itself, working with creative director Kevin Flood. In total, almost 100 people was involved in creating this exhibition. In coming up with the brief for the exhibition, Kevin Flood had some clear aims to guide the progression of the project. He wanted to bring a sense of the people who'd once worked, lived and died in the hospital into a museum space. He wanted to give our students an opportunity to create original work for public display. He also wanted to use the form of animation to engage and attract an age group that the museum saw as underrepresented, so 16 to 24-year-olds. He wanted to explore with using digital audiovisual technology to make a curatorial intervention in a packed, permanent collection that's housed in a listed historical space that's already crammed full. And finally, he wanted to explore whether animated films could be a kind of label and serve as a form of interpretation of the museum's objects. So it was really important that the films had a clear relationship with the objects in the collection. Now, at this point, Alison and I would like to flag up a few aspects of project work between higher education and museums, because they may not be obvious to a non-teaching audience. So, firstly, it's really hard to coordinate projects between higher education and external agencies. We've got specific times of the year when students are available for project work. Students need support and they need a realistic time frame to deliver the project on time. In order for partnerships such as this to be successful, a project has to be a named part of the curriculum and subject to assessment. In this case, all the Central St Martin's students were assessed on their contribution to the project. So it was big projects for them. The students worked for 4 to 7 months, so there was large amounts of teaching time involved in that, crits, summative evaluation, and they were also given specific professional expertise. So in the case of animation students, by Shelley Page from DreamWorks, who was an advisor to the project. In the case of the curating students, they were mentored by the narrative designer, Mark Irving. Now, each of the 40 animation students involved was paired with a composition student from the Guildhall School of Music, and they were encouraged to collaborate on the soundtrack from an early stage. However, the music students weren't assessed on their contribution to the project, and at times it was quite hard to manage their motivation. So all of these factors, plus the numbers of participants and stakeholders involved, means that there's a lot of work in project management involved in delivering a project like this. So, secondly, forming part of an educational experience, students are able to experience working to a client's brief and delivering on time to a deadline, so that's positives for us. However, this kind of project cannot simply function to deliver a prescribed commission. The brief has got to provide challenge, inspiration, space for the students to make their own creative contribution. And as part of our aims as an educational institution at Central St Martin's, any project we do has got to engage with a certain amount of openness to process, to risk, to creativity, and future professional identity. So the relationship between the collaborative organisations, in our case, the museum and Central St Martin's, is of the utmost importance. And there needs to be a deep understanding of this as a special case. It's not a commission. It's not a commercial project. It's an opportunity for creative talent to engage with museums and archives and contribute a fresh perspective. And thirdly, I won't go into a lot of detail about this, but you can ask me about it later. The nature of the project, such as this, is that it involves students. It doesn't involve practicing professionals. So it's important to address the issue of potential failure right from the outset and to have support and a contingency plan in place. So let's fast forward to what the project outcomes were. We created curated artifacts. In total, 40 one-minute animations were produced, each one working with an object on display in the museum. The films were curated by students from MA Curation, Culture and Criticism, and placed as interventions into the museum's permanent collection. They were shown in loops in 7 places throughout the space, projected or on iPads. The films were tucked away in drawers and surgical cabinets, and they were projected onto the wall of the famous anatomical theatre above and below cabinets. There was also a programme of events held over consecutive Friday evenings, including panel discussions and a film screening of the classic silent film The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari with live musical accompaniment. There was a social media presence, so all of the students involved and the staff who participated created a buzz on social media through Twitter and a Facebook page. And finally, an app was produced in place of a printed exhibition catalogue that holds all 40 of the animations. So this is a legacy project that's available to download on the Apple App Store. So, to wind up my section of this talk, just to reflect on my experience of using animation in museums and archives, animation theorist Alan Cholodenko considers animation as being much more than a technical form of filmmaking. He considers it to be a paradigm or a conceptual process through which still and lifeless matter is given the impression of life through motion. And in engaging with museums and archives, the contribution we've made to these collections through animation, it's like a haunting or a reanimation of historical objects. Using an artifact to inspire storytelling through animation, we can speculate and imagine the story of an object's original usage or owner. Through fiction and informed retelling, we are able to contextualize an object's backstory and engage the visitor's imagination. Animation can work for museums and archives in ways that live-action film cannot. It can bring new forms of interpretation to a collection. It can depict the past, recreating ruined buildings or broken artifacts, and it can conjure up the subjective experiences of the long dead and forgotten. It can imagine the future, speculating on possible worlds, and it can visualize and explain complex data and ideas. And I'm now going to hand over to Alison to talk more about the curatorial aspect of this project.
Okay, so MA Culture, Criticism, and Curation is a younger course than character animation, but nonetheless, in the 3 years that I've been running it, we've had each year sort of particular strategic partnerships with museums and organizations mainly based in London. And I'll mention just in passing, at the same time that we were working on the Cut exhibition, we were doing a Share Academy project with the South London Gallery on digital democracy. So I thought I would talk about how the Old Operating Theatre project let us test out concepts and strategies within curatorial practice, because for both Birgitta and myself, this is an implicit rationale in our choice of projects. So for my course, Cut was a departure in the curatorial work we'd been involved with, and it was one of the reasons why the Old Operating Theatre and one of the reasons was because of this thing that Birgitta's already mentioned, that the Old Operating Theatre and Herb Garrett was a space that was already full. So thus, the curatorial task prohibited what is sometimes a sort of tacit first impulse, I think, to kind of clear everything away and start from scratch. So the project pushed us to jettison the notion of building from nothing. And I think you'll recognize there's sort of an intransigence of the white cube sort of motif as a curatorial ideal that often kind of precludes other ways of thinking about curating. So I would also characterize this particular issue as a continual challenge for the curating students. So they had to switch from a mode of putting things in or taking them out, and instead to take on what the place and its contents already was, and to how a restricted intervention could alter, albeit in a minimal fashion. So the question was, in other words, how do you do a lot with a little? And I think I mean that differently from how that same question was posed earlier by Simon Chaplin, and that seems interesting. So in this next section, I'm sort of turning to what Birgitta and I were talking about as the sort of theoretical heavy lifting of the presentation. And in a sense, coming to it as somebody interested in curatorial practice, in the history of exhibitions, in sort of some of the historical and theoretical conditions for curating, it becomes important to always be balancing sort of the pragmatic and the operational issues with the more reflective ones, the ones based in research. So in this section, I'm actively trying to link up some sort of theoretical questions with what the exhibition project provided for us. So I found myself turning to a figure widely cited in discussions of museology, collections of objects, in archives, and that is the French philosopher Jacques Derrida. So bear with me on this next section, but I think it mattered to us. So Derrida's concept of différance, the supplement of hauntology, and his writings on subjects and the archive, these all present rich terrain, we would argue, for drawing out some of the concerns the tutors and the students encountered on this project. So Derrida's early work was in theories of language, and this focused on his term différance, which he coined to elaborate how language communicates directly, but also does so by ellipsis and by displacement. So drawing on structural linguistics, his argument was twofold. First, that meaning isn't bound up in single words, but in chains of them, and that each defers to the next, and that words act in direct relation to each other, as, for example, the way oppositions develop generate understanding through being linked rather than being considered singly. So Derrida's well-known kind of concept of deconstruction was his method for decoding the way language often hides these oppositions. And it's worth remembering that he was insistent that such binaries were always about the investment of power. They were never compatible dialectics, and they were never innocent. So the richness of these ideas become evident when applied to the way meaning is generated through place, objects, and other forms of communication in the scenario of museums. We can call this a semiotics of curating and exhibition design. And in fact, Derrida himself often addressed, he was a philosopher, but he addressed cultural forms such as painting and literature, and he turned his thoughts explicitly to architecture, spatial design, and film in a published interview from the mid-1990s entitled The Spatial Arts. I'll change images there. So this is an important interview for our project for several reasons. First, Derrida speaks about the authority that objects hold over being mute, in their being mute, and about their resistance to words. And for me, this leads to ongoing questions about interpretation. However, in a fashion typical to him, Derrida points out a paradox that mute objects produce words, or perhaps better, we produce words to compensate for their muteness. And I take this as to be a kind of warning against our tendency to speak over things. Derrida also spoke in this interview about film, its mobility, its sequentiality, and its temporality, and he suggests that like mute objects, film is both resistant to and productive of discourse. This is a still from one of the animations I'll use here. So he argues further that film is a medium trying to bridge or to interpolate between the word and what he calls the silent arts. So this kind of idea that maybe the animation is a kind of bridge between the words that we use to describe objects and the objects themselves. So turning to cut, we can observe how distinctive the animations were from anything already in the museums. They were moving, and then again, they were repetitive. They told stories, and they projected music and voices, which made them very different from the things that they joined in the old operating theater. And for me, there was something about their nature as both creative and interpretive things that made them contrast strongly with the museum's collection in a positive way. So curatorially, the inclusion of films in this space, their light, the stories they told, the technology that they evidently used, which made them seem very foreign to the context, spoke to questions of authority, about authorship and power in ways that resonated with Derrida's thinking about discourse, and with how authority is presented in museums. So as Birgitta already indicated, one of the original ideas for the project was to return through the animations some of the missing people that were implicated in the museum's collection of tools and implements. To go back to the kind of unknown, the stories of the unknown numbers that came in with either disabilities or serious injuries, some of whom would survive and some of whom who died right there. And actually, this film in particular was about a particular surgeon who practiced in the museum, and he was the speed in which he developed the ability to kind of perform an amputation. So many of the animation students took this brief to task and imagined people who passed through the space or as patients or as surgeons. And what we want to do is show one of them. This one imagines Kevin Flood, the creative director of the museum, working late one evening and being visited by a Victorian nurse who gives him advice on what to show in the museum. So I'll just show this one.
Ah, I guess it's time for your annual visit. Would you tell me this time why you come here every year? Oh. would like me to exhibit this.
The reason that one spoke to me for this presentation was because it actually deploys one of Derrida's other favorite word, which is this concept of hauntology. And in hauntology, Derrida talks about it as time out of joint. And thus we're back to this key concept of différance. So setting out a kind of a different sense of time than the kind of present moment that is presumed for objects and texts that make up exhibitions. So I think we always hope that museum objects in and of themselves invoke enough wonder to create interest. But I think what the project helped us explore was another way of making this happen. So to conclude, the juxtapositions between original, authentic, erratic objects and their reinterpretation and recontextualization through contemporary digital animations proved popular with visitors and raised issues about how audiences relate to the objects in the museum. It enabled the museum to consider how to reinterpret their permanent collection through a temporary exhibition of moving images. We would like to mention that the app did achieve this kind of wide kind of reach. So the app, which the MACCC students produced, proved really popular, and visiting school teachers from as far away as the United States asked to be able to use it in their classrooms. But to conclude, I wanted to bullet point a couple of points. So first off, and especially I think this is important for this conference, that the project for us wasn't driven by technology, but by being imaginative and using it. It was invested in bringing creative practitioners into the museum to make new artifacts that had interpreted old ones. And we did the project because it allowed us to expand our disciplines at the same time as being able to offer our students formative experiences. So we think it's a strong example of knowledge sharing between the museum sector and universities, since partners entered into it with an openness that facilitated a kind of genuine innovation. Thank you.